behalf of the University Lectures Committee and the Department of Philosophy, I'm very pleased to be able to present to you Professor Marjorie Green. Professor Green holds a BA degree from Wellesley College and her MA and PhD degrees from Radcliffe in the days before Harvard would give a PhD to a woman. So she got them from Radcliffe. She is presently Professor of Philosophy at the University of California at Davis. Prior to going to Davis in 1965, Professor Green lectured in a number of universities in both the United States and Europe in philosophy, including the University of Texas, the University of Chicago, Northwestern University, and Boston University in the United States, the University of Leeds in Manchester, and Göttingen University in Germany. She has been truly impressive in the field of scholarship. The quantity of her output is very impressive. She's written a number of books on a number of philosophers, including books on Aristotle, Heidegger, Sartre. She has a book on epistemology and a book on philosophical biology. She has also written articles in English, French, and German in every major area of philosophical study, including the history of philosophy, metaphysics and epistemology, philosophy of science, and value theory. In addition to all the writing she's done, she's had time to translate 3 books, and she has been very active in professional societies. Most recently, she has just completed a term as president of the Metaphysical Society. Tonight, she's going to give a lecture entitled Mind and Brain, the Case of the Missing Person. We tried to get her to be a Cartesian, and we gave it mistakenly the title Mind and Body, the Case of the Missing Person. But she won't accept that Cartesian distinction, and she insists on the proper title, Mind and Brain, the Case of the Missing Person. She is a delightful and erudite person, and I'm very pleased to present her to you. Now, we're going to do this in 3 stages. We're going to have the lecture, then there will be time for question and answers from Professor Green, and if coffee and cookies show up, which have been ordered, but they haven't appeared yet, but if they do appear, we'll have an informal time with her at the end of the question period. So I present you Professor Green.
I don't know that mind and brain is any less Cartesian a title than mind and body, but it doesn't really matter. It happens that it's the mind-brain sort of controversy that this thing really takes off from. Actually, my title was Mind and Brain, the Embodied Person, and it was Professor Van Eyten who had the lovely idea of calling it the Case of the Missing Person, which is really what it is. Well, philosophical problems, it used to be thought by many practitioners of that discipline, are sharply separated in their pure conceptual character from the concerns of the empirical sciences. And of course, in a way, this is true. No advance in empirical knowledge can settle once for all a philosophical problem. Yet empirical discoveries do have a bearing sometimes on philosophical questions, even though it's difficult to specify just exactly what kind of bearing it is. The context of the present reflections is in one of those in-between areas. The occasion of the paper was a conference on philosophical implications in the neuromedical sciences, and I was trying, so far as a neurological layman might, to see in relation to some specific examples what the mind-body or mind-brain problem might be said to amount to, and what direction we might take or have taken, if not to resolve it, at least to lessen its tension. Let me put my problem first by referring to a statement by the great brain physiologist Carl Lashley, published in 1958. The difficulty in understanding the mind-brain relation, Lashley asserted there, stems from the fact that only the content of consciousness is directly known, while the interpretation of that content derives from its ordering. It is the content, he holds further, which seems to be stubbornly mental, while the ordering is more readily accounted for in neurophysiological terms. Now, Lashley, of course, was no armchair philosopher, but a hard-headed experimental scientist. Yet what he is doing in the passage I'm referring to, it seems to me, is to succumb to the very same temptation to which, he rightly reminds us, philosophers have too long been addicted. That is, he has separated something called sensations or the like, the so-called content of consciousness, from their interpretation and the ordering on which their interpretation depends. But it's precisely the myth of sensations on the one hand, and on the other hand the myth of a single unitary consciousness which somehow contains them, that has led philosophers, psychologists, and even neurophysiologists into the tangle of arguments and counter-arguments that have plagued and, it seems, continue to plague us. True, whatever may befall psychologists or neurologists, no post-Kantian philosopher ought to have succumbed to this temptation. But as Kant should have been the first to recognize, what ought to be is not always what is. I want to argue here that once we've rid ourselves of the incubus of sensations, we can consider our various ways of making sense of the things around us. First, not primarily in terms of minds, but of persons, and second, not in terms of a simple unity of consciousness as the sole criterion of personal identity, but rather in terms of a narrative model of the person which is grounded both in our bodily nature and in our cultural and historical reality. But let me get down to cases. One of the recent developments in neurophysiology that philosophers have been much taken with concerns cerebral disconnection and its clinical consequences. Let me start with the by now classical case of P.J.K., the patient of Geschwind and Kaplan, reported in 1962, and remind you briefly of their observations, as well as of the philosophical problems which, according to Geschwind, these observations suggest. Sperry's work with Drs. Bogan and Vogel's Kamashural patients uses a more sophisticated experimental apparatus, but Geschwind and Kaplan give a more detailed case history, and it seems to me also that the way Geschwind poses the possible philosophical challenges in the papers I'll refer to in a moment is clearer than the concluding section of Sperry's paper, 1970. So I'm going back to an old source of 1962. I need repeat only a fragment of the observations described by Geschwind and Kaplan in order to lay the groundwork for my argument. They report, with his eyes closed, the patient correctly and rapidly named objects and cardboard letters placed in his right hand. Similarly, he could, after the object was taken away, correctly draw the object which had been in his hand. If letters or numbers were traced on his right hand, he generally named them correctly. You all know, of course, the right hand is connected to the left brain and vice versa. By contrast, when objects, numbers, or letters were placed in the left hand, the patient with eyes closed generally named them incorrectly. The errors usually bore no resemblance to the stimulus object. For example, a ring was identified as an eraser, a watch as a balloon, a padlock as a book of matches, and a nail as an elastic. The errors were not constant. Thus, on another occasion, he called a ring a package of some sort. A screwdriver on one test was a spoon, and on another a piece of paper. It was striking to observe that when handling the objects, he would move them actively about within his fingers and would focus on their salient features. For example, he inserted his finger into a thimble, ran his thumb over the teeth of a comb, rubbed the bristles of a toothbrush, and retracted the point of a ballpoint pen. Despite his appropriate handling of the dominant features of these objects, he misnamed them all. When it was made clear to him that he was to show how the object placed in his hand was to be used, the subject, with eyes closed, proceeded with little hesitation to manipulate the item correctly, usually giving, simultaneously, an incorrect verbal account. Thus, given a hammer, he made hammering movements correctly, while saying, "I would use this to comb my hair with it." Given a key, he went through the motions of inserting it into a lock and turning it, but said that he was erasing a blackboard with a chalk eraser. Holding a pair of scissors correctly, he made cutting movements in the air, but said that I'd use that to light a cigarette with. When his eyes were open, he correctly identified the objects in his left hand. Further, if an object or letter was placed in the left hand behind the patient's back, he generally was unable with the right hand, 1, to select it correctly from a group of objects presented to him either visually or tactually, 2, to write the name of the object, or 3, to draw a picture of the object. For example, a letter which would have been drawn correctly with the right hand, after having been held in the right hand, was drawn incorrectly with the right hand if the letter was placed in the left hand. Similarly, if objects were placed in the right hand, the patient was usually incapable of performing any of these maneuvers with his left hand. We need not concern ourselves here with the detailed diagnosis of the patient's pathology, which was correctly predicted by Geschwind and Kaplan and confirmed by postmortem examination. It suffices to say that there was disconnection of 80% of the corpus callosum. The question that concerns us is the question, what, if any, philosophical reflections does such a case suggest? Geschwind, in his disconnection paper of 1965, and again in a 1967 paper on the apraxias, lists 3 areas where conceptual questions arise, of which the first and third seem to be rather clinical than philosophical. First, the question of the whole patient. This is a practical matter. Of course the patient was a whole person, even if his symptoms resulted from callosal disconnection. And I'm sure that when Geschwind or Kaplan drove him from home to the hospital for outpatient observation, as they report that one of them did, he or she treated him as such. What is in question here is the demand for a holistic approach in clinical practice, like that advocated by Kurt Goldstein, though, as Geschwind has pointed out elsewhere, abandoned even in Goldstein's own interpretation and treatment, where localized areas of the brain rather than global conditions seem to be involved. Geschwind's third point, the reliability of introspection, is again a practical matter. Of course, if the speech areas in the left brain are isolated or damaged, introspective reports will not be reliable. But the problem that teases the philosopher's imagination is the second one Geschwind raises, the question of the unity of consciousness, one of the problems listed also by Lashley in the paper I referred to at the start. Surely the patient is feeling normally with his left hand. All his behavior indicates that he's doing so, and indeed special tests were devised to show that this was the case. But this perception doesn't get through to the left brain. Is the patient somehow of 2 minds? Some philosophers have drawn on the works of Geschwind, Sperry, Gazzaniga, and others to suggest that more exact judgments may be distinguished from more intuitive judgments, or what we spell out hedged from what we would rather not recognize in our own consciousness. That such complexities of our mental lives may be correlated, perhaps even identified, with the asymmetry of cerebral organization. These are comforting neurological underpinnings for philosophical arguments, and I'm all for them. But my question is a different one. Does the unity of consciousness have to be thought through in a new way in the light of cases like that of Geschwind and Kaplan, and if so, why and how? A colleague with whom I was discussing Geschwind's statement insisted that philosophically, the case of PJK's discordant behavior and seemingly discordant experience is no different from the old Berkeleyan case of the 2 hands, one preheated, one pre-cooled, placed in a basin of tepid water, where one feels hot and the other cold, a case nicely photographed in Richard Gregory's book, The Intelligent Eye. I'll have more to say about his interpretation of it in a moment. It's true that the subject in this case has indeed 2 consciousnesses, that is in Berkeley's case, in the case of 2 sensations, one hot, one cold. What did Berkeley infer from this sensation? Not never mind, but only no matter. And couldn't he have said in the Geschwind-Kaplan case also something like this? Usually the algebra of ideas God has given us to work with, ideas identical with what the vulgar call objects, guides us pretty well. But this poor Boston cop was misguided because the objects equal ideas that constituted his brain were damaged, and so the mind somehow connected with this set of ideas or objects contained peculiar ideas or objects instead of normal ones. I had to admit that this would be a logically possible interpretation. But it seems to me, and would to most of us, I hope, a terribly far-fetched one. Just as Berkeley's own interpretation of the tepid water experiment appears to me, or us, at least some of us, a terribly far-fetched one. The difference, it seems to me, comes from the difference in what we in our historical intellectual situation take for granted and what seems questionable or difficult to account for. Berkeley thought he knew, there were sensations, as Lashley still affirmed. He also thought he knew, these were ideas which must be in a mind, something Lashley presumably would not have liked to accept, at least not in a straightforward or literal sense. Moreover, Berkeley thought he knew, mind as substance and as agency, himself as the cause of his actions, a relation which appears to us, I think, a very mysterious and complicated one, not at all self-evident. I, for one, find it very hard to tell when I've really done something and when I've been pushed. Finally, Berkeley thought he knew, the existence of an all-powerful, all-good deity who had arranged all these ideals equal objects so that other things, like sins or brains being equal, we would be guided adequately through this vale of tears and reap our reward hereafter. But such an all-powerful and all-good deity is a self-contradiction, as Hume, following Epicurus, amply proved. And most of us, I surmise, would not care to interpret Geschwind and Kaplan's data, or Berkeley's either, with his help. If Bishop Berkeley is at present casting golden crowns upon a glassy sea, I hope in the hell I'll soon be frying or freezing in, I shall at least be vouchsafed that knowledge. In any case, to Berkeley it was utterly clear that there is God, there are minds which are active agents, there are ideas which they passively contain. It was not clear to him that there are material things distinct from our or any consciousness. For us, on the other hand, it's clear that there is a natural world of which we as animals form part. How our minds are organized, what agency is, let alone what God is, if we're still willing to entertain the question, is what has become problematic. And that there are sensations, isolable, identifiable, single bits of consciousness out of which experience gets built is just plumb wrong. Why so many intelligent people in the 18th century, even David Hume, believed in them, I'll never know unless some brilliant intellectual historian tells me. But certainly our everyday experience just is not made up of such psychological atoms. Even a case like the two hands one entails a context. It's precisely the context that gives the appearance of paradox, and the further temporal context that alleviates it. Even Philonous or his poor stooge Hylas couldn't have obtained this baffling pair of feelings if he hadn't first kept one hand in hot water and the other in cold. A mere manipulation of ideas? Nonsense. The hidden metaphor in manipulation sharpens the point. Moreover, the denial of such a psychological atomism is part, at least, of what Geschwind and Kaplan's observation of their patients suggests as well. The human brain, normally functioning, is a pluralistically organized, immensely complex machine used by the human person possessing one for the unitary apprehension of some aspect or other of the world around him, which other things being equal, and in particular the corpus callosum being intact, he can also report in reliable unitary fashion. Human minds, as they mature, are the uses made in cultural contexts of these pluralistically organized software machines. What I take to be obvious, not logically necessary, but acceptable to any reasonable person, is, one, the existence of an external world which contains me, even though it doesn't directly feel my feelings, a world external to my lived body, not external to some non-fleshly black box type feeling apparatus inside me. Two, the realistic thrust in general of my perceptions and reports of perceptions, even though they're not incorrigible. Three, the uselessness, if not absurdity, of any concept of substance, whether mental or material. Four, the contextual, already organized nature of almost all, if not all, so-called immediate perceptions. Five, a difference of some kind between my actions and those of other intelligent agents, and the motions accounted for by the explanations of physics and chemistry, but a difference that takes some pretty complicated thinking to explain it and is by no means self-evident either in general or in any particular case. God we can leave out of it. That there is in some sense some reality expressed by or corresponding to the religious experience of religious persons, I do not want to deny, but that a theory of perception includes or should include reference to some such reality, as it does in Berkeley's, or for that matter Descartes' case, I would emphatically deny. Indeed, it is the involvement of deity that makes their theories of perception so unsuccessful and so quaint. What then, in terms of these very different presuppositions, do we make of Berkeley's case of the two hands in tepid water? Gregory's interpretation is as follows, he says. One hand is placed in a bowl of cold water, the other in hot. If the hands are then placed together in a bowl of tepid water, the water feels and is judged to be at the same time warm for one hand and cool for the other. The cold and hot water have selectively adapted the hands, upsetting their calibration, so that temperature is then judged incorrectly by each of them. Although we know intellectually that water cannot be both hot and cold at the same time, this is how we feel and judge it to be. The brain does not reject the paradox. We experience something we know to be physically impossible. That's the end of my quotation from Gregory. This statement is disquieting. On the one hand, we feel and judge. On the other, we know intellectually. But judgments are judgments. Is a perceptual judgment radically different from an intellectual one? I find myself here in a dilemma, or perhaps just in a muddle. For on the one hand, I want to accept Gregory's general thesis that perceptions are hypotheses, but not his acceptance of Helmholtz's view of them as unconscious inferences. There just isn't any inference in the hot and cold hand perceptions. We feel them that way and report them that way if asked to do so, just as we see the lines in the Müller-Lyer illusion as unequal and report this perception even though the ruler shows us they are equal. Illusory perceptions are mistaken hypotheses we can't help entertaining alongside, once we have other evidence, the hypotheses or meta-hypotheses that they are incorrect. True, they are hypotheses forced on us by circumstance and the nature of our nervous systems, and then this distinguished from the more loosely held hypotheses, which we can correct either through perceptual or conceptual learning. But I don't see where in the perceptual case the inference comes in. All the way from perception to the most refined theoretical knowledge or artistic insight, we are trying, out of and within our given biological historical situation, to make sense of some aspect of experience, whether closer to sensed experience or more theory-laden and further abstracted from it. Some of these appraisals, as Polanyi calls them, or instances of sizing up, to use Wallace Matson's term, have been railroaded by evolution into fairly rigid and occasionally deceptive paths, which must, however, on the whole have been reliable guides to coping with the real world, else natural selection would have eliminated them or us. Others, thanks to the loose and complex organization of our brains, with its non-limbic cross-connections characteristic of no other species, and thanks to our development within one culture or another as initiators and users of highly structured symbol systems, are more flexibly connected to sensory input and more easily susceptible of learning, criticism, and correction. Only in cases of that, like PJK, do we notice, through the oddities consequent on callosal disconnection, how delicate and perilous is the kind of intellectual coping we usually do. And even it, of course, is not only brain-mediated, but percept-mediated as well. Perceptions are hypotheses, yes, yet contrary-wise, all hypotheses are grounded in perception, from which they spring and to which they must ever again return. Perception as hypothesis, or perception as information actively accepted, as J.J. Gibson, in a position at least partly convergent with Gregory's, has come to interpret it, is both the paradigm and the ground of all our knowledge. Perception, mind you, full, sinnful, world-oriented perception, not those mythical givens, in the demolition of which philosophers have wasted almost as much time, breath, and ink as they did in their defense. But let me not waste more. One more point, though, in interpretation of the case of PJK and the question of the unity of consciousness. In emphasizing the primacy of perception, embodied being in a world, I may seem to some to be abandoning consciousness altogether for a crude physicalism. And I am indeed alleging that mental existence is embodied. But that is not enough. In the case of human persons, at least, mental existence can be achieved not through neurological forces and processes alone, or even bodily forces and processes in general, but only through the complex interplay of the person's bodily being and the artifacts, family structure, social and political institutions, languages, art forms, rituals that have both permitted his development to take the shape it has taken and prevented it from taking any of an indefinite number of alternative but no less human forms. Look again at Geschwind and Kaplan's patient. True, a medical history is only a very partial and truncated history, but even it tells something. PJK, a 41-year-old married white male Boston police officer, 40, not 20 or 60, married, not single, white, not black, Oriental, Mexican, American, or Puerto Rican, male, not female, Bostonian, not Parisian, for example, a member of the police force, not presumably a pusher or a tap dancer or a neurosurgeon. Maybe indeed even this brief description informs us of more than it says. I've been told that I came home from my first day at kindergarten in New Haven, Connecticut, and asked, "Mother, are we Catholics or Republicans?" The person lives somehow at the center of what the complex organization of his body permits and the complex organization of his social world or worlds demands. This confluence of shapes and forces, any simple identification of mind with specifiable bits of consciousness at one extreme, or with a simple unity of consciousness at the other extreme, necessarily fails to capture. And if a subjective unity of feeling or of feelings fails to do the job, so much the less will the concept of an objective physical, even biological unity do it, at least not on its own. Only the historical span of this lived body in its world can identify a person as this person and no other. The loosely but subtly interwoven structures of the human brain provide one set of necessary conditions for such an existence. The more or less loosely but subtly interwoven structures of the human world provide another set equally necessary. Mind, if you want to call it so, develops in the tension between the two. But this is not the opposition Lashley suggests between a content of consciousness immediately known and an interpretation of it derived from its neurophysiological ordering. The content is already interpreted, as we can tell when, as in PJK's case, its normal ordering breaks down. In Kantian terms, experience is always already a synthesis of the manifold. Moreover, the content is lived bodily, an inside alien to Kant's still Cartesian way of thinking. And on the other side, the ordering has been from the beginning not only electrochemical, but at the same time artifactual and symbolic. It is the unity of being in a world, always ambiguously psychophysical, always ambiguously public-private, always ambiguously active-passive, that provides the ground of personal identity. And even when, as in both our cases, a simple unity of consciousness breaks down, that is both the PJK case and the Berkeley two-hands case, routinely in sensory illusions like the tepid water one, or more dramatically and anomalously in the perceptions and reports of the colossal patient, there is recognizably one person whose history includes these less or more puzzling features. Like Hylas or Philonous, PJK continues to cope up to a point with the situations of ordinary life. Indeed, in the more recent cases of patients with callosal disconnections surgically induced for the relief of severe epileptic seizures, the subjects presumably coped on the whole better after than before surgery. In other words, we acknowledge in each case the presence of a person, the anomalies of whose perceptual experience point up the subtlety with which our normal dealings with things in our world are organized. Here is a personal history with some kinks in it, sufficient sometimes to disturb the patient himself, as reported, for instance, in the case of one commissural patient, a very mild-mannered man, whose left hand after surgery occasionally reached out and slapped his wife to his own surprise and embarrassment. This is still a personal history, if an odd one, not no personal history at all. So far, I have responded both to the contrast posed by Lashley and to the question raised by Geschwind. by sketching what I take to be some reasonable assumptions about personal identity in its relation to traditional views of immediate experience and of a consciousness which is said to unify it. One can hardly question the unity of consciousness in our day and time, however, without acknowledging the effect on this venerable concept of the impact of Freud and the notion of something, or some process or set of processes called unconscious. The person is not to be in any simple way identified with a unified consciousness, not only because of the pluralistic organization of his brain, not only because of the pluralistic organization of his social world, but because much of his mental life, much of what makes him a person, is either preconscious or unconscious. In the latter case, accessible to consciousness either not at all or only through the esoteric techniques of psychoanalysis. But if, as a student of philosophy, I'm ignorant of neurology, I must confess to an even more profound ignorance of psychoanalytic literature and practice. In a mood like that of Kant at the beginning of the dialectic, therefore, I hesitate to leave the firm ground of cerebral connections and disconnections for the vast and, to me, uncharted sea of depth psychology. Quickly, however, I must dive in and hope to surface again before suggesting in conclusion a direction for philosophical reflection in the face of the questions I've raised so far. Let me take my quick dip at one special and I hope not too dangerous place. Suggested both by Robert Solomon's recent essay in the Doubleday Freud volume, edited by Wollheim, and by the first part of Alistair McIntyre's argument in his book, The Unconscious, published coincidentally the same year as Lashley's paper. Both Solomon and McIntyre stress the importance of Freud's early neurologically oriented project. Freud himself disowned and even tried to burn this early manuscript. Not, however, it seems, because he wanted to disown a neurophysiological foundation for his psychic apparatus of id, ego, superego, but only because the neuroanatomy of the time was inadequate to support it. What matters for my present thesis in this piece of history is that Freud's rejection of the traditional identification of mind with conscious mind did not signal a return to classical dualism, with the psychic system of energy, repression, sublimation, and whatnot as a free-floating set of non-physical events or entities. Rather, as Solomon stresses, Freud's use of quasi-metaphorical, quasi-physical terms suggests an awareness that its forces in the human organism, and therefore materially existing, ultimately neurophysiological processes, that develop or are frustrated and diverted in their development in the patterns Freud describes, or something like them. I'm not suggesting that we accept all his mythology. But of course, on the other hand, it's clear on the face of it that the forces Freud is describing are also psychological and social forces, impacts of the human world upon and organizing interpretation of experience, but acknowledgement of the person as a task, placed irrevocably between the two inextricable poles of his existence. It means reading mind as the uses of the body, as mediator of and participant in the structures of psychical and interpersonal reality. Where, finally, as philosophers, do we go from here? A recent paper by Tom Nagel, What Is It Like to Be a Bat, begins, consciousness is what makes the mind-body problem really intractable. I hope he meant this to be funny. Clearly, were it not for consciousness, we would have no problems at all. And were it not for self-consciousness or reflective consciousness, a consciousness of being conscious, we would have no philosophical problems, including that of mind and brain or mind and body. But at the same time, it's not funny. It is, on the one hand, the concept of immediately known units of consciousness that Lashley mentions, and on the other, the concept of a simple and straightforward unity of consciousness of the kind questioned by Geschwind, that has misled philosophers as well as some neurologists, and has complicated the task of transcending the kind of oversimple, hypostatizing mind-body dichotomy bequeathed to us by Descartes. Either, as Heidegger argues in The End of Philosophy, philosophers have enclosed themselves in a cage of subjectivity from which they can find no escape to the realities of the human, let alone the natural world, or, chiefly in the British tradition, which Heidegger ignores, while they have indeed sought the contrary of the subjective, that is, the scientific or exact, they have found paradoxically the objective shrinking to sensations as happened to Hume, for example, and his wake to Russell. So the seekers for objectivism either become more subjective than the subjective philosophers themselves, or in despair, like Quine or again like Russell, they throw the subjective and with it consciousness overboard altogether and cling dogmatically to the laws of physics or behavioristic psychology, how known by whom, as their only support. Nagel's cure for this last and indeed deplorable move is, he says, to reinstate the subjective. There must be something it feels like to be a bat and something else it feels like to be human. But it's not just a question of feeling. That's the whole point. It's a question, to put it in quasi-Aristotelian terms, of what it is for a bat to be as distinct from what it is for a human being to be. To revert to feeling or the subjective or to consciousness as the medium of our inquiry would be to fall back into the very trap set for us by the past 300 years of philosophical thought. There is no need for such a relapse, however. In my discussion so far, I've been drawing, without naming them, on a number of contemporary sources for a different approach to, or better if you like, evasion of, the traditional problem. I've suggested that we take person rather than mind as our central concept. This move is familiar to Anglo-American philosophers, chiefly through the work of P.F. Strawson. Strawson identified persons as individuals to whom both material and person predicates apply. This was a radical move in the empiricist tradition, but still, I think, inadequate to take us safely beyond the perilous shoals in which Hume grounded us, or the equally perilous depths of more Teutonic speculation. What one needs further as a necessary condition for an adequate philosophy of the person is a distinction between the subjective and the personal, a distinction which is carefully drawn in Michael Polanyi's Personal Knowledge, but so presented, I'm afraid, that most of his readers have failed to understand it. The subject in Polanyi's usage is that minimal aspect of experience which can only be authenticated, not verified as in empirical statements making objective claims, or validated as in mathematics or the arts. If a neurologist tests my skin for normal sensation, only I can authenticate for each pinprick the claim, I feel it or I don't feel it. This is the kind of subjectivity Lashley and I take it Nagel are referring to. It constitutes, except in moments of intense pain or ecstasy, a very minor strand of experience, relatively inward, relatively passive, extremely evanescent. The personal, in contrast, is the whole organized span and spread of an individual history, which I've already referred to. It is at once active and passive, at once mental and bodily, at once public and private. Further, that the being of a person is being in a world is the thesis drawn in the first instance from Heidegger's Being and Time. But the emphasis on bodily being, lived bodily being on the one hand, and immersion on the other hand in a common human world, is derived rather from Merleau-Ponty's phenomenology of perception than from Heidegger's non-sexed and, when authentic, I believe, non-social Dasein. Many of my locutions, further, derive or could be derived from Helmut Plessner's philosophical anthropology. That one needs to interpret the person's being in the world in an historical or narrative mode is a thesis again supported by philosophical argument from a number of sources. In a way, it's Heideggerian, although here again I find Merleau-Ponty's approach less strangely askew than Heidegger's concept of destiny. Moreover, the notion of something like a narrative model of man I have heard proposed independently by A.C. McIntyre in Boston and G.H. von Wright in Jyväskylä in Finland. Clearly there is a road to travel, and partly already well-traveled, that leads to the alleviation of the tension described by Lashley or the puzzle posed by Geschwind. In conclusion, however, I want to make what is perhaps a more heterodox, but yet I hope pertinent proposal. Not at variance with the sources already mentioned, but in support of them, I want to suggest that relative to the notion of either units of consciousness in the tradition of empirical philosophy, or of a unity of consciousness in the traditional concept of the self as a kind of entity, what is needed, and what has already been happening in some of the literature I've all too sketchily mentioned, is what Jacques Derrida calls a deconstruction of the tradition. True, Derrida is dealing, for the most part at least, with the more speculative, chiefly continental strain of philosophizing, while I've been speaking here largely in terms consonant with the empirical branch of our divided Cartesian heritage. His proposal, however, should apply, as I hope to show you, to both styles of argumentation. What does Derrida mean by deconstruction? To tell you even very briefly, I shall use language that will probably sound very strange. Traditionally, Derrida believes, philosophers have longed for, and even alleged that they have found, a presence of the mind to the really real, a univocality and luminousness in living thought and in its spoken expression, which can bring our hope of ultimate understanding to fulfillment. This hope of presence, he insists, has persisted throughout the history of Western thought, all the way from Plato's claim to know the forms almost 3,000 years ago to the theses underlying modern linguistic theory and phenomenology. What we need now is to deconstruct this claim, not to demolish it, that's hopeless, but at least to pry ourselves loose from it, to acknowledge a different aspect of language and of meaning. What we need to stress is not the alleged presence of the mind to reality, but on the contrary, the gap between meaning and meant, saying and said, that characterizes all discourse and all thought. Writing, it has been claimed from Plato onward, is a bad second best to speech. It is dead speech, or as Saussure put it, language in drag. But in Derrida's view, the externality of sign signified, that's symptomatic of writing, in fact characterizes all language, spoken as well as written, and indeed experience itself, which after all is organized, as the structure of the brain suggests, in traces of traces, never at one with itself in the fashion that the dream of presence demands. His central theme, therefore, is what he calls difference, the temporalizing and temporizing of experience, its differing from itself in the sense of contrariety or conflict, the gappiness within and beyond the synthesis that on the surface gives it meaning and form. We cannot escape the hope of presence, as we cannot escape in some form a demand for a unity of consciousness as what unifies a human life. But we must complexify that notion, so to speak, allow it its roots both in lived reality and in artifact, stretch it to meet the conflicts, pluralities, byways that confront us equally when we consider, as admittedly Derrida is usually far from doing, the intricacies of cerebral organization or the complexities of the human world within which a given human brain in its given human body achieves its particular history and to which, in its unique way, it gives expression. Derrida, as I've indicated, is trying to pry philosophical thinking loose from what is basically a Platonic attitude, the hope of the soul's or the mind's vision of the forms. More down-to-earth reflection in the Anglo-American vein, however, stands just as much in need of a parallel deconstructing move. One may plausibly argue, indeed, that that's what the later Wittgenstein was trying to do for it, but that's another story. But let me return here finally to another passage in Gregory's The Intelligent Eye, which suggests, a contrario, the direction in which I believe we need to move. Granted, Gregory is a psychologist, not a philosopher, but the position he takes is only too typical of much philosophical doctrine, and I venture to take it as such. He is speaking, in the passage I want to refer to, of what appear to him the unique achievements of man, or at least of modern scientific man. There are two such achievements, he tells us. The second is measurement, which seems relatively trivial and is a major force local to modern Western science. The other is language, which allows, in Gregory's words, logical and numerical relations to be expressed without ambiguity. It permits, in other words, a precision otherwise impossible. But such a thesis represents the traditional Platonic delusion from the other side, or strictly the Aristotelian or Cartesian delusion, for Plato knew only too well the necessary imprecision of language. Is it really literal, exact reference that language facilitates? Let us return for a moment to Geschwind and Kaplan's patient. If with eyes closed he held a key in his right hand, he could name it correctly, whereas if he held it in his left hand, he would say at random, "It's a rubber band or a comb or what you will." Yet if he drew the key with his right hand, corresponding to the left speech-endowed hemisphere, he would make only a rough outline, while if he'd held the key in his left hand, although he couldn't name the object correctly, he would draw it with extreme precision. The left brain's achievement of language, this suggests, functions not to produce precision, which belongs rather to the more literal-minded but inarticulate right brain, but rather to permit a kind of tricky imprecision, to borrow a phrase of Geschwind's. Or to quote Geschwind again, language works by producing data reduction at the expense of precision. Imprecision is of its essence. In Derridean terms, speech is a power of producing not so much exact or literal meaning as metaphor. It is a power of drawing together the unlike, which are yet somehow or other the like. It is a rather diffuse and messy capacity, well suited to coping in a rather diffuse and messy way with a rather diffuse and messy world. Philosophy under the spell of science, or of an oversimplified model of science, needs deconstruction just as urgently as does philosophy under the spell of traditional metaphysics, perhaps more urgently because it speaks in our day with more authority.
We may have found our person, but we haven't found the coffee and the cookies, so
Well, we can have
don't
questions.
worry. All right. Nick says they will come. In the meantime, Professor Green consented to respond to your
Mind if I
questions.
sit down? I don't think I can see people unless I sit on the table, if I may.
Oh, all right.
Fall over.
Anywhere you like.
But I can't stand up any longer.
Okay. So,
Sorry, I threw so many names at you. I was told it's going to be a very high-powered scientific audience. Heard of Geschwind and Kaplan and Lashley and so on and so on. But I can tell you more about who they are, if that would be appropriate at this late date. Yes.
Do I gather from what you said that you regard the existence of mind and the existence of God in the Cartesian sense as unanswerable, or will you answer them both negatively?
No, I don't know how an existence would be unanswerable. But the question of the existence of mind in the Cartesian sense, I would certainly answer negatively. The question of the existence of God doesn't seem to me to have anything to do with what I was talking about, namely, in the context in which I was talking about Berkeley's case, the theory of perception. Because it seems to me very peculiar with both Descartes and Berkeley that they have to fish in God to justify our knowledge of the external world. We're in an external world, whether God put us there or not. So that's all I was questioning was the use of divine benevolence or divine mathematics or whatever in an interpretation of perception.
So whatever the answer to that question is, it's irrelevant to what you were saying.
That's right. And also I was saying that as far as I'm concerned, in our cultural situation as I understand it, it isn't obvious that there is God. And it seems to me it's very obvious there is not mind as a separate substance. In fact, in my view, the substance metaphysics can go either to Spinoza on the one side or Hume on the other, and then it's done. I mean, you can take Spinoza if you want. Then you've got God and substance both, but you don't have mind as separate from body. But if you go the Humean way, then you get rid of it altogether. But I don't see how a Cartesian concept of two substances somehow plunked together in a human person. I recognize a lot of people accepted it in the 17th and even 18th centuries, but it seems to me it was in itself incoherent. It did a job that needed to be done then, but I don't see how one can buy it now. At least it would have to be argued for in some very sophisticated way. I was just trying to sort out what seemed obvious to Berkeley as distinct from what seems obvious to me, and I think to a lot of people in our particular cultural situation, intellectual situation. Yes? Just,
No, that's all right.
go ahead.
Do you think it's the fact that we can be aware of our own awareness which has lent plausibility to this metaphysical dichotomy for millennia now?
Millennia?
Well,
Millennia? Well, I guess millennia. Yes, you go back to Plato.
I mean, a lot of people have found wondering why.
I suppose that may be why.
Introspectively, the mind.
Yeah, I don't know whether
is separate.
introspectively would be the, see, I don't know. I don't know enough about, sort of general history of ideas and so on. The thing is that if you go back to sort of ancient animistic beliefs or primitive animistic beliefs, it isn't just human beings that are supposed to have souls, but trees and thunderstorms and all kinds of things in the world. So I don't really know to what extent that introspective element is something more recent and not the essential reason why this happens. Certainly, self-consciousness is a necessary condition, as I said, even for the existence of philosophizing, for reflection at all. But how it was tied as a reason or a cause to the Origenist kind of view, I really wouldn't know at all.
Because children are never afflicted with this split. They're quite integrated, and it would never occur to them.
Yeah, they used to be
before the
taught
stage
it, of
being
course.
aware
But,
of their awareness.
right. On the other hand, there are there are a great many cultures in which spirits are supposed to be all over the place. Now, maybe those spirits aren't different from body, just as we find it hard to understand what the Pythagoreans meant by saying all things were numbers. Maybe they meant numbers sort of like little pebbles. I don't know. That's what some people tell me. But it's hard for us to get back of this categorization. There clearly is something in Plato akin to modern dualism. But I don't know how widespread that is in Greek thought. The view of the afterlife, for instance, was much mistier than ours. The ancient Jewish view of the afterlife was much mistier than the Christian one. So, this notion of some separate immortal something, actually that's not even universally Christian, because if you take the Thomistic notion, you've got, this mind belonging to this body, and then you have to have matter formed for this particular soul, and so on. It's not just, as with Descartes, matter spread out in space, and then minds as separate entities. I think one would have to be a much better historian than I am to know how this came about. You had a question?
I suppose I might classify myself as a bit of a scientist, and I'm interested in PJK.
Yeah.
I've never heard much about him, but it seems to me that at certain levels there isn't really much of a problem. What's the hang-up about with regard to PJK?
Well, the hang-up was supposedly that his experience of the things around him has got rather mixed up compared to most
He's
people's.
sort of
That's
a
all.
mixed up guy,
Yeah.
but then, you see, for instance, we could just go a little more simply and just say, I'm looking at something. I look at something with this eye, where, just with nothing on, and then I look at something with some sort of polarized colored glass with this eye. So I'm going to see some different things.
Yes, but you're
Okay.
seeing them in each case in a unitary way. Whereas he seems to...
Well, now...
Yes, you are.
You're putting a philosophical...
No, I'm not. I'm saying this is in both cases stereoscopic vision. Whereas he's got a funny divided experience that it seems as if his left side were doing something different from his right side.
Look, but then I regard myself as a halfway normal individual, and I feel myself divided, torn up, and not knowing what I think most of the time.
Fine, that's the lesson of PJK. Sure, that's what
This guy had a bad case of it.
That's right. That's just the point.
But now, you see, I want to go a little farther. So we have a curiosity here. We could examine this scientifically by so-called, whatever this scientific jazz is. We could look at it, and I'm sure we could find out all sorts of things. Now, this seems to pose a philosophical question. Now, it seems to me that it is no use asking a question unless one has settled in one's mind something about the form of the answer.
How can you ask a question when you've already settled the form of the answer?
Well,
It
if
wouldn't
you
be very
don't know
interesting
there's
question.
something about the form of the answer which is acceptable to you, there is no point asking the question. I insist on that. I'm not going to I mean, otherwise it's meaningless. It's a bunch of mumbo jumbo.
That's going a little far.
Look, you know,
You have to have some idea what you mean by your question. And you're looking for the answer along some track or other, but you don't know the form of the answer before you start asking the question, or it wouldn't be a question.
You know, I could say, here's a question. Why is the sky blue? Well, I don't know. Well, or you ask me that, and I'd say, well, gee, I don't know. How am I supposed to answer this? What sort of an answer do you want? Physical sort of answer? Okay? Or an emotional sort of answer, or
Well,
whatever?
that's a bad categorization.
Well, okay, you produce a better one. Now look at that.
I've been trying.
You know, if one doesn't put some restrictions on the possible form of the answer, there is no point in answering.
That's different from what you said before. Putting a restriction on the possible form of the answer
Okay.
is not knowing in advance what the answer is going to be or what kind of answer you're going to get. Oh, well, that, sure. Well, nobody could object to that.
Okay, well now then,
So
what
what?
is the form of the answer which one wants when one looks at PJK?
The form of the answer I want to be trying to tell you is an answer in terms of a theory of the person rather than in the terms of a theory of mind as distinct from body. That's all. Somebody back there had a question than you. Yes.
This PJ is more of a
JK.
question of disjunctive identification versus relative action.
This is relative action. I don't understand that.
He acted with his left hand correctly. It was brought out in every case. His vocal identification was more or less chance.
When it was that side, of course, if he held something in his right hand, he could
the
name
side
it.
that's in question is the left hand, and only the left hand, by the way, with the outline. Now I want to establish, has it been established that his mental answers were irregular enough to be pure chance, or did they have
Yeah.
some basis?
No,
Because
yeah.
if they be if each time in confrontation he come out with something different, it would be irregular enough
It was,
to
I
have
think.
meaning.
Yeah.
But if he did come out at any time with the two irregular answers,
Yeah.
it would question the chance possibility.
No, I think it was pretty clear to them, and has been pretty clearly established in the Bogan and Vogel cases too, that it is random. There just is no connection between the nature of the stimulus object and the name associated with it. That's fair enough. There was somebody else over here.
Poor Descartes, I sometimes really feel sorry for him.
He's had his innings.
At one point, people have had innings for him.
Yeah.
One point early in his career, I think it's really the first time he stepped forward, and the second time in print, worried to death about what happened to Galileo. He put forward the statement in the 4th chapter of the Discourse on Method about the absolute separateness of mind and body, which he tried to retract or tone down later in the very same
Where did he
document.
ever retract dualism?
Certainly does.
In the rules, the body of the very first rule for the direction of the mind, which true wasn't published in his lifetime, which he wrote in about 1628, he makes the dualism of mind and body absolutely fundamental to his distinction between the arts and sciences.
He also insists that the mind is not lodged in the body.
Like a pilot in a ship, I know.
And people, and what on earth does he mean? What he says is, repeatedly and over again, and his readers just don't hear him because they reading him
Right.
as a two-part dualist. He says there is a person, the whole person,
Yes, that's
the
true.
nature of
He
which is
does.
known by ordinary speech and ordinary
right. That's
intercourse.
true.
And there is, in addition to the person, concepts, the person he calls them items of understanding, which might be ideas in maybe a more Kantian sense. He also says there are ideas, his word, which means we'd say sensations or fantasy.
No, wait a minute. Some ideas may be sensations, but clear and distinct ideas are acts of the mind are intellectual.
When he distinguishes items of the understanding from
Yeah.
items of
Right, imagination
ideas,
or sense.
imagination, that was it, imagination.
right.
So he has items of imagination,
Yeah.
items of understanding, persons, and items of extension.
Yeah, but the point is that persons,
Four part-
yeah,
four
not
part-
really, because the metaphysical underpinning is the mind and the body. There is res extensa, there is res cogitans, they are supposed to be together during this life in a way more intimate of that of the pilot in the ship, but he cannot coherently explain how this is. He tries to do it through the pineal gland, and he gives an account of the way that all the physical goings on happen in the body, which agitate the soul, which is sitting up here, and it's pretty
He
poor.
has a problem with the interface, but the interface is between the person and what the ideas. It isn't an interface between separate mind and separate body. He tries to assert this repeatedly.
How can it, well, what is the person that's at the
That's the
interface
great
then?
question. That's why he put Strawson's notion of person as an emergent particular, an irreducible
Yeah.
item, is neither a great advance in the discussion nor a solution to it. It's as
It
old
isn't a
as
solution,
Descartes.
I agree.
It's as old as Descartes, and it's a name for our problem. Where before, in this oversimple interpretation,
Right.
what Descartes was trying to say, we had ideas on one side and matter in the other. Now we've got persons.
I'd like to see the text again where he says that the interface in the pineal gland is between the person and what happens in the brain, rather than between the soul and what happens in the brain. Does he say person? What's the term? It must be in the passions of soul. It's not anywhere else that I know.
The pineal gland is mentioned in the passage.
And but what does he say that is confronting the motions of the brain in the pineal gland?
Well, I don't recall the exact.
I'll bet you anything it's on.
I have been through it with pencil and paper, and he's insistent that it isn't just two separate substances.
No, I know that in the sense that he insists they interact very
What we
carefully.
instead is the concept of the person as an emergent particular, and he asserts this, he does say this, but he denies that the separateness of the two as early as the Meditations.
Why does he say in the Meditations that his theory is such hot stuff for believing in the immortality of the soul? The soul is separable from the body. Why does he say that animals don't have souls but only men? Because the thinking substance is implanted at conception in the body.
He believes only human beings are persons. That's what he believes.
they're
That
born
may be a
after
prejudicial, anti-animal
They have no way to
view.
compare.
But the point is, he does believe in persons, not just separate.
Yeah, but I don't believe he believes in them coherently. He does say, it's quite true, that,
At least as
They
coherently
never
as
experienced
Strawson
it
does.
themselves. They
well, I'll give you that. I just said that most people get the notion of persons from reading Strawson's individuals, but that is not a coherent argument. But neither is Descartes.
If indeed
have a
the
society that has
person
such a high
is a
degree of
basic
security.
particular, in addition to
You're
Yeah.
guaranteed 9 years of schooling. They're
we have
trying to
another kind of
develop
interface
kids in
problem
9
that
years
is a
of
correlative
You're
to the
guaranteed
old
at least some kind of
interface
work.
between mind and
Everybody's
body.
guaranteed some
Namely,
kind of work.
interface between persons in the world that don't matter within
They
each person's
seem to
act.
think,
That's
well,
true, that we
Whether it's
have.
in the pineal gland or wherever it is, you've still got
Instead
an
of that, they
interactionist
tend
problem. It
sometimes
is a
some of the
question for
youth
which we have no solution.
focus in on
There's
some
no solution to it in the
inequalities
history of
which
thought.
still exist.
It's a
in the
big,
socialist system.
unsolved problem.
For example, there are not
What we
enough
have is a
places
name
in
for
the
a
higher
problem, nothing
education
that's like a
system
solution.
to take all of the youth. They can't guarantee every youth higher
Human
education.
being is mysterious.
How are you going to handle
All
that?
right. That's true.
Some people,
How about Ms. Green's paper?
after
No, that's not supposed to be a solution. I think it points a direction
either
for trying to understand this, but there's an incoherency in the kind of solution I'm suggesting that comes pretty much at the point you suggested, namely that if you're going to go the Heidegger Merleau-Ponty, and particularly the Merleau-Ponty way, and talk about being in the world as
then you'll
always
be able to understand their feelings.
bodily, social at once,
desires in life. What
then you're going to be in trouble when you want to distinguish the
Mainly
mental
Chinese
from the
countryside
physical, and you often do.
state it was
So,
24 years ago.
This is not, I wasn't saying, here's a solution, but I think it's
Good sanitation,
it seems to me a better way to go
scientific way
than
of
the more
farming,
abstract.
it's all big problems, and somebody's going to have to do it. Well, the revolution of winning power, that was the old
Everyone knows that the cookie and the
The revolution of changing the bottom rungs of
One cookie for all of us?
Is there one more question?
Yes.
make the most of it, make your effort. So all of you, most all of you.
I think I tried to say somewhere, I said that the mind, I said first of all that the brain was a complicated piece of software machinery, and that the mind was the uses made of this machine in
For some
the
reason, I don't know why.
kids don't like to be barbers or a
physical,
waiter.
biological,
That's
and
another thing.
social setting
Behind
of
the
a
solve
person,
problem.
of a given
Because,
individual.
you know, you want to send them there, but they
I'm
want to be
saying
a
the mind is
doctor
the
or an
uses of the
engineer or
brain,
something like
but that
that.
you can only
And you
talk
can't
about the
blame them for
mind
that.
if you take into account a
once
cultural
again,
or social
time
as well
comes
as
for graduation.
physiological.
You have your study group, you sit down and discuss this whole problem.
No, not,
And you put, you know,
no.
your feelings right on the table. And you have frank discussion, you know,
Not
what
in
I want, what
reactions
the
of
country
the brain.
needs,
A
how to
reaction is
combine these two
That
things.
sounds like,
And
stimulus
sometimes
response
it can
stuff.
meet, sometimes it can't meet. But one thing.
Not
we can make
reactions,
very clear,
because we don't just react to
new
culture, we're in it,
society
we're an
and this new
expression of it.
society, there's no such thing as
I
high
can't
work
say
and
it
low
better
work.
than saying the mind is the uses,
Barber
not just
sounds
of the
rather
brain,
low. Doctor,
but uses
engineer
made
sounds
of the
rather high.
body
No, this
in
is not the way you
certain
categorize work.
cognitive,
All work is
intellectual
honest.
contexts. I mean, the mind
All
isn't
work
all
is making a
uses of the
contribution
body.
to building new
Spinoza
society.
said that the more different
It's only
ways to use
division
your
of
body,
labor.
the better your mind.
This
And
is the way you
always
look at it.
worries me because I can't
All
think
work
that
is
Olympic
honorable.
gold medal winners really